Sometimes a man rides into the mountains to escape his past, only to find it waiting for him in the last place he'd look. Jonas Mercer had spent 5 years keeping to himself in the Montana Territory, trapping game and asking nothing from the world. Then one cold afternoon, he spotted smoke rising from a cabin that should have been dead and empty. Inside, a woman lay collapsed on the dirt floor, barely breathing. Her hands were bruised, her clothes torn. Jonas had seen enough suffering to know when someone was running from death. But what made him lift her into his arms and ride hard for town wasn't her condition, it was the mark burned into that cabin. Dodot, a symbol he thought he'd buried 5 years ago. What? Could she know that was worth dying for? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Montana Territory had a way of swallowing men whole. Some came looking for gold, others for land, and a few, like Jonas Mercer, came looking for silence. He'd found it too. High in the canyon country, where the pine trees grew thick, and the nearest neighbor was a 3-day ride through country that could kill you if you didn't know its moods. Jonas knew its moods. He'd spent 5 years learning them. 5 years since he'd turned his back on the life he'd built as a lawman and disappeared into these mountains like smoke on wind. Out here, the only law was survival, and the only judge was the land itself. That suited him fine. His cabin sat in a narrow valley where a cold creek ran year-round, and the hunting was good enough to keep a man fed. He'd built it himself, every log notched and fitted by hand, the roof shingled with split cedar that kept the rain out and the warmth in. It wasn't much, just one room with a stone fireplace, a narrow bed, and a table he'd carved from a lightning-struck pine, but it was his, and it asked nothing of him except that he keep breathing. Most days followed the same pattern. Up before dawn, coffee boiled over the fire, then out to check his trap lines that stretched across 20 miles of wilderness. He'd reset the traps, skin whatever he'd caught, and pack the pelts in salt before the day grew too warm. Marten, fox, beaver, all of them fetched decent prices when he made his twice-yearly trips to Greystone, the town he'd left behind but couldn't quite escape. The knife at his belt was never far from his hand. He'd had it since he was 16, a gift from his brother Thomas, on the day they'd both sworn in as deputies in a town neither of them would recognize now. The handle was wrapped in worn leather, dark with years of use, and both their initials were carved into the brass guard, JM and TM, linked by an ampersand that felt more like a scar now than a symbol. Thomas. Even thinking the name brought a weight to Jonas's chest, a heaviness that 5 years hadn't lightened. His little brother, 3 years younger and twice as idealistic, the kind of man who believed the law could actually mean something if the right people upheld it. Jonas had believed that once too, before he'd seen enough corruption and compromise to know better. He'd left law enforcement 8 years ago, sick of watching guilty men walk free because they knew the right people or had the right amount of money. He'd taken a job as a ranch hand, then a hunting guide, drifting further from civilization each year until he'd finally settled here, in country so remote that even the maps got vague about where exactly here was. Thomas had stayed. Thomas had believed he could make a difference, that one honest lawman could turn the tide. Jonas had tried to warn him, tried to tell him that the system was rotten from the inside out, but Thomas wouldn't hear it. They'd parted on bad terms, angry words between them that Jonas would give anything to take back now. 3 years after Jonas disappeared into the mountains, word had reached him through a trapper passing through. Thomas was dead, killed in a shootout with the Blackwood Gang, a group of outlaws who'd been terrorizing the territory for years. The details were sparse, an ambush, they said. Thomas caught alone on a mountain road. They'd buried him in Greystone, and by the time Jonas heard, 6 months had already passed. He'd never gone to see the grave. Told himself it was too far, too dangerous to show his face in town where people might remember him, might ask questions about why he'd left his brother to fight alone. The truth was he couldn't bear it. Couldn't bear seeing Thomas's name on a stone. couldn't bear the finality of it, so he'd stayed in his mountains, working his trap lines, speaking to no one except the occasional trapper or prospector passing through. Once in a while, maybe twice a year, necessity would drive him to Greystone to sell his pelts and stock up on supplies. He'd time it for early morning, get in and out before the town fully woke, speak to as few people as possible. The one exception was Samuel Hewitt, who ran the general store and had known Jonas back when he still wore a badge. Samuel was close to 60 now, with a white beard and kind eyes that had seen enough of life not to judge a man for his choices. He never asked Jonas why he'd left or why he stayed away. Just conducted their business with quiet dignity and sometimes slipped an extra box of ammunition into Jonas's supplies without charging for it. "You take care up there," Samuel would say, and Jonas would nod. And that would be the extent of their conversation. The mountains didn't judge him. The mountains didn't expect anything. They simply existed, ancient and indifferent, and Jonas found a kind of peace in that indifference. He could work until his muscles ached, fall into his bed exhausted, and sleep without dreaming. Most nights anyway. This morning had started like any other. Coffee at dawn, then a long ride north to check the trapline that ran along Silver Thread Creek. He'd caught 2 marten and a decent-sized beaver, all of them fresh enough that the pelts would be worth something. The November air was cold enough to sting his lungs, and the sky had that flat grey colour that promised snow before nightfall. He'd been working his way back south, following the narrow game trails that wound through the canyon country, when he'd first noticed something off. The forest was too quiet. Birds should have been calling, squirrels chattering in the pines. But instead, there was only silence, the kind of silence that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Jonas had survived 5 years alone by trusting his instincts. And his instincts were screaming now. He'd reined in his horse, a sturdy buckskin mare named Della, and sat listening. Nothing but the wind moving through the trees and the distant cry of a hawk. He was about to move on when he saw it, a thin column of smoke rising from somewhere ahead, grey against the grey sky. Smoke meant people, and people this far out meant trouble more often than not. He should have turned around, should have headed back to his cabin and let whatever was happening happen without him. That was the rule he'd lived by. Don't get involved, don't ask questions, don't look for problems that aren't yours. But the smoke was coming from the direction of the old Harper cabin, a place that had been abandoned for at least 3 years, maybe longer. Old man Harper had died one winter, and his widow had moved back east to live with her daughter. The cabin should have been empty, slowly falling in on itself the way abandoned places do. Jonas sat his horse for a long moment, torn between the instinct to ride away and something else, something he hadn't felt in years. Curiosity, maybe, or concern, or just the old lawman's reflex that said, when something's wrong, you check it out. Finally, with a sigh that misted in the cold air, he urged Della forward. Just a quick look, he told himself, just to make sure it wasn't some fool prospector who didn't know this was private land, or a fire that might spread if the wind picked up. Just a look. And then he'd be on his way, the decision made. Jonas touched his heels to Della's flanks and headed toward the smoke, toward the abandoned cabin, toward the moment that would change everything. The Harper cabin sat in a shallow bowl of land where the canyon walls curved inward like cupped hands. Jonas approached it carefully, keeping to the tree line, his hand resting on the rifle scabbard at his knee. Della sensed his tension and moved quietly, her hooves finding soft ground between the rocks. The cabin looked worse than he remembered. The roof sagged in the middle, several shingles missing, and one of the shutters hung crooked on broken hinges. But smoke was definitely rising from the stone chimney, thin and grey. The kind of smoke you got from a fire that was mostly embers. Jonas dismounted 50 yards out and tied Della to a pine tree where she'd be hidden from view. He drew his Winchester from its scabbard and worked the lever, chambering around with a metallic click that sounded too loud in the quiet. Then he moved forward on foot, using the terrain for cover, every sense alert. As he got closer, he could see that the cabin door was slightly ajar. No horse visible, No signs of recent activity outside, except for some disturbed snow near the entrance. The windows were too grimy to see through, and no sound came from inside. Jonas paused at the corner of the cabin, pressing his back against the rough logs. His heart was beating faster than it should, and he recognized the feeling, the same electric tension he used to get before kicking in a door on a warrant. He'd thought he was done with this, done with the spike of adrenaline and the copper taste of fear in his mouth. He moved to the door and pushed it open with the barrel of his rifle. The smell hit him first. Blood and sweat and wood smoke, the particular combination that meant someone was hurt badly. The cabin's interior was dim, lit only by the dying fire and the weak daylight filtering through the dirty windows. It took his eyes a moment to adjust. Then he saw her. A woman lay on the dirt floor near the fireplace, curled on her side like she'd tried to get warm before collapsing. Her dress was torn and stained dark in places Jonas recognized as blood. An arm was stretched out toward the fire, as if she'd been reaching for its warmth. Her hair was dark, tangled across her face, and she wasn't moving. Jonas swept the room with his rifle, checking the corners, the shadows. Empty. Just him and the woman and the dying fire. He moved inside quickly, closing the door behind him, and knelt beside her. She was alive. Her chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, and when he pressed his fingers to her throat, he found a pulse, weak and thready, but there. Her skin was cold despite the fire, and when he gently brushed the hair from her face, he saw bruises along her jaw, a split lip, dried blood at her hairline. Her hands drew his attention next. The knuckles were scraped raw, and her fingernails were broken, several of them torn down to the quick. She'd fought hard. Dark bruises circled both wrists like bracelets, the kind you got from being tied up tight. Jonas felt anger rising in his chest, the old familiar rage that had made him a good lawman once upon a time. Someone had done this to her. Someone had hurt her badly and left her here to die. He was already calculating what he'd need. Water, bandages, warmth. He'd have to get her back to his cabin, tend to her wounds properly, then figure out how to get her to a real doctor in Greystone. It would be a hard ride, and in her condition, that's when he saw the door. He'd been so focused on the woman that he hadn't paid attention to the cabin door itself. But now, as he glanced back toward the entrance, the light from the fire caught something carved into the wood. No, not carved, burned. A brand seared deep into the old planks. Jonas stood slowly, his rifle forgotten in his hand, and walked to the door like a man in a dream. The symbol was crude but unmistakable, a circle with a jagged line through it, like a lightning bolt splitting the world in half. Below it, 3 smaller marks that could have been letters or could have been nothing, half obliterated by age and weather. The Blackwood brand. Jonas's vision tunneled. His breath came short and fast. 5 years fell away in an instant, and he was back in Greystone, standing over his brother's coffin, listening to the sheriff explain how Thomas had been killed by the Blackwood gang, how they'd found him on a mountain road with 3 bullets in him and the same symbol carved into a tree nearby. The Blackwood gang was supposed to be finished, scattered, arrested, hanged. Jonas had heard the stories even up in his remote valley, how a federal marshal had finally brought them down 2 years after Thomas's death, how Silas Blackwood himself had been killed in a shootout near the territorial border. But brands didn't appear on doors by accident. Someone had put this here recently, and if the gang was gone, then who? Behind him, the woman made a sound. A soft moan, barely audible, but it snapped Jonas out of his paralysis. He turned back to her, knelt down again, and this time he noticed something he'd missed before. A leather cord around her neck, half hidden beneath her torn collar. He gently pulled it free and found a silver locket, tarnished but solid, about the size of a $1 coin. His hands shook as he opened it. The photograph inside was small, faded, but clear enough. A young man in a deputy's uniform, smiling at the camera with the kind of confidence that came from believing the world made sense. Jonas knew that face better than his own. He'd watched it change from boy to man, had seen that same smile across a dinner table 1,000 times. Thomas. The locket slipped from Jonas's fingers and swung on its chain. He stared at the woman, really looked at her now, trying to understand. She was maybe 30, with fine features beneath the bruises, dark hair that might have been carefully pinned up before whatever hell she'd been through. Not the kind of woman you'd expect to find bleeding out in an abandoned cabin in the middle of nowhere. Who was she? How did she have Thomas's picture? And what did she have to do with the Blackwood gang? As if hearing his thoughts, the woman's eyes fluttered open. They were grey, the color of storm clouds, and completely unfocused. Her lips moved, forming words that had no sound. Jonas leaned closer. "Easy now. You're hurt, but you're safe. I'm going to help you." Her hand moved, fingers grasping weakly at his sleeve. She was trying to speak, trying desperately to tell him something. He put his ear close to her mouth. "Thomas," she whispered, the word barely a breath. "Thomas Mercer." Jonas pulled back, staring at her. "What did you say?" Her eyes found his face, and for just a moment they focused with terrible clarity. "Thomas," she tried again, and then her body convulsed, a cough racking her frame. Blood flecked her lips. "Don't talk," Jonas said, his voice rough. "Save your strength. I'm going to get you out of here." But she was shaking her head, frantic now, trying to make him understand. Her hand tightened on his sleeve with surprising strength. "They killed him," she managed. "They killed the marshal." Her words dissolved into another cough, and Jonas knew he was running out of time. Whatever she knew, whoever she was, she'd die here if he didn't move now. He made his decision in an instant. Sliding one arm under her knees and the other behind her shoulders, he lifted her as gently as he could. She weighed less than she should, and he could feel bones through the fabric of her dress. How long had she been running? She cried out softly when he stood, and he murmured an apology, moving toward the door. He'd have to come back for his rifle. But right now, the priority was getting her on his horse and putting distance between them and this place. As he stepped through the doorway, carrying the woman who knew his brother's name, who wore his brother's picture around her neck, Jonas Mercer felt the carefully constructed walls of his isolation beginning to crumble. The past he'd tried to bury wasn't buried at all. It was waiting for him. And it had teeth. They didn't get the chance to rest. Jonas heard them first, the distant sound of horses moving through timber, still far off but getting closer. He held up a hand to silence Claire, who'd been rebandaging her ribs with strips torn from her petticoat, and moved to the entrance of the shelter. The snow had stopped during the night, leaving everything covered in a fresh white blanket that would show tracks like ink on paper. Their own trail led directly to the shelter, clear as day, to anyone who knew how to read sign. Jonas cursed himself silently. He'd been so focused on getting Claire to safety that he'd forgotten the most basic rule of survival: always hide your back trail. "How many?" Claire whispered. Jonas listened, counting the rhythm of hoofbeats. 4, maybe 5. "Moving slow, tracking. It's them." Claire's voice was tight with fear. "It has to be." Jonas made a quick calculation. The riders were still 10 minutes out, maybe 15 if they were being cautious. Not enough time to pack up and run without leaving an obvious trail, but enough time to prepare. "Can you shoot?" he asked Claire. She nodded. "My father taught me. Not well, but I can hit what I aim at if it's close enough." Jonas handed her his revolver, a Colt that had seen him through more fights than he cared to remember. 6 rounds. Don't waste them. If things go bad, you run for the horse and ride north. There's a ridge about 2 miles that way. Follow it east and you'll hit the main trail to the capital. What about you? I'll slow them down." He checked his Winchester, then pulled a box of cartridges from his saddlebag and loaded his pockets. "With luck, they'll think you're alone, and I'll have surprise on my side." Claire grabbed his arm. "Jonas, there are too many of them. Even if you... 5 years ago, I would have ridden away from this fight," Jonas said, meeting her eyes. "Would have told myself it wasn't my problem. But Thomas died because no one stood with him when it mattered. I'm not making that mistake again." The sound of horses was closer now. Jonas positioned himself behind a fallen log 20 yards from the shelter, where he'd have a clear field of fire and decent cover. He'd chosen this spot deliberately. The approach to the shelter forced riders into a narrow funnel between two rock walls, limiting their ability to spread out. Through the trees, he caught his first glimpse of them. 5 riders moving in a loose formation, rifles across their saddles, eyes on the ground, reading tracks. The man in front sat tall in his saddle, wearing a long coat and a black hat with a silver band. Even from this distance, Jonas could see the cold intelligence in the way he moved, the careful attention he paid to every detail. Silas Blackwood. Had to be. The riders stopped about 50 yards out, and Jonas saw Silas raise a hand. They were conferring, probably deciding on their approach. Smart, Jonas thought. They knew someone had helped Claire, knew they might be riding into an ambush. Silas called out, his voice carrying easily in the cold air. We don't want trouble, friend. Just looking for a woman who stole something that doesn't belong to her. You hand her over, we'll ride out peaceful. Jonas stayed silent, sighting down the Winchester's barrel. You're making a mistake protecting her, Silas continued. She's a thief and a liar. Whatever she told you, it's not true. We're the aggrieved party here. Still, Jonas said nothing. Let them wonder, let them worry. Silas's tone hardened. All right, then. We'll do this the hard way. He gestured to 2 of his men, who split off and began working their way up the flanks, trying to get an angle on the shelter. Jonas tracked one of them, a lean man with a pockmarked face and a rifle he carried with the ease of long practice. When the man was 30 yards out, Jonas shot him. The Winchester's crack echoed off the canyon walls, and the man tumbled backward off his horse, dead before he hit the ground. The other rider dove for cover as Jonas worked the lever and fired again. The bullet sparking off rock where the man's head had been a second before. All hell broke loose. The remaining riders scattered, 2 diving off their horses and scrambling for cover behind rocks. One staying mounted and charging directly at Jonas's position. Bold or stupid or both. Jonas shot the horse, hated to do it, but he needed to even the odds. And the rider went down hard, rolling behind a boulder. Return fire came fast and angry. Bullets chewing up the log Jonas crouched behind, sending splinters flying. He kept his head down and moved, crawling 20 feet to the right, where he'd have a different angle. From his new position, he could see one of the dismounted men trying to work his way closer to the shelter where Claire was hidden. Jonas put a round through the man's shoulder, spinning him around. Not a kill shot, but it took him out of the fight. Claire! Jonas shouted. Time to go! He heard Della's hooves, saw Claire burst from the shelter at a gallop, heading north like he'd told her. One of the gang members tried to draw down on her, but Jonas shot him in the leg before he could fire. 3 down, 2 still in the fight. Not bad odds, but not good either. Jonas had maybe 6 rounds left in the Winchester, and no chance to reload. Then Silas Blackwood stepped out from behind cover. And Jonas understood why the man had a reputation. Silas didn't rush, didn't panic. He simply stood there in the open, rifle at his shoulder, and fired with the calm precision of a man who'd killed too many times to count. His first shot took Jonas's hat off. The second grazed his shoulder, burning like fire. The third would have taken his head off if Jonas hadn't thrown himself sideways behind a boulder. I know who you are now, Silas called out. Jonas Mercer. Thomas's brother. I killed him, you know. Put 3 bullets in him personally and watched him bleed out in the dirt. The rage that filled Jonas was white-hot and absolute. He wanted to charge, wanted to put his hands around Silas's throat and squeeze until the life left his eyes. But rage got you killed, and dead men didn't get revenge. He begged at the end, Silas continued, his voice casual, conversational. Asked me to give you a message. What was it now? Oh yeah, he said to tell you that you were right, that the law was a joke, and trying to fight corruption would just get you killed. Funny, isn't it? His last words were admitting you'd been right all along. Jonas's hands shook on the Winchester. Every word was calculated to provoke him, to make him do something stupid. He forced himself to breathe, to think, nothing to say. Silas laughed. That's all right. We'll catch your woman soon enough. She can't have gotten far in her condition, and when we do, I'll make sure she suffers for every one of my men. You killed today." A bullet smashed into the rock near Jonas's head, and he realized the other gang member was flanking him. "Time to move." He fired twice more, one shot to keep Silas's head down, one at the flanking man, then turned and ran. Jonas caught up to Claire 2 miles north, where the ridge flattened into a stretch of open ground dotted with scrub pine. She'd slowed Della to a walk, and when she saw him running on foot, she wheeled the horse around. "They're still coming," Jonas gasped, swinging up behind her. "2 of them, including Silas. Did you killed one, wounded 2 others. But Silas is good, really good." Jonas took the reins, urging Della into a hard gallop. "We need distance, and we need it now." They rode for another hour, pushing Della as hard as they dared, taking every switchback and cutback Jonas knew to confuse their trail. The sky had cleared, and the sun was bright on the snow, making everything painfully bright. Good for seeing, bad for hiding. Finally, when Della was lathered and blowing hard, Jonas pulled up in a dense thicket of pine, where the branches grew so close together they formed a natural roof. He dismounted and helped Claire down, then spent 10 minutes brushing out their tracks with a pine branch. Claire collapsed against a tree trunk, her face gray with exhaustion and pain. The ride had reopened something, and Jonas could see fresh blood seeping through her makeshift bandages. "Let me see," he said. Kneeling beside her, she pulled aside her torn dress, and Jonas saw the extent of the damage. Bruised ribs, yes, but also a knife wound in her side that she'd somehow failed to mention. It wasn't deep, but it was infected, the edges red and angry. "Why didn't you tell me?" Jonas demanded. "Would it have changed anything?" Claire's voice was weak but defiant. "We still would have had to run. I still would have had to ride." She was right, but it didn't make Jonas feel any better. He had some whiskey in his saddlebag. Not much, but enough to clean the wound. Claire bit down on a stick while he poured it over the knife cut, her whole body going rigid with pain, but no sound escaping her lips. Tough, Jonas thought again. Thomas would have liked her. "Tell me about him," Claire said after he'd finished bandaging her properly. About Thomas. What he was like before all this. Jonas settled back against a tree, keeping his rifle close. He was stubborn. Once he got an idea in his head, nothing could shake it. Used to drive me crazy when he was young. He'd decide he wanted to learn something, tracking or shooting or reading law books, and he'd work at it until he got it right. He sounds like you. He was better than me. Had a moral compass that pointed true north no matter what. I got cynical, got tired of fighting, but Thomas never did. He believed people were basically good, that society could be better if enough people stood up for what was right. Is that why he became a deputy? Jonas nodded. After our parents died, he could have taken a dozen different paths. Could have worked a ranch, could have headed west to the gold fields. But he wanted to be a lawman because he thought it meant something. Thought the badge stood for justice. It did to him, Claire said softly. Yeah, it did. Jonas was quiet for a moment. I should have been there for him. Should have stayed instead of running off to hide in the mountains. He didn't see it that way. He told me once that you'd given him the greatest gift, the freedom to choose his own path. Said you'd raised him to think for himself, and that was worth more than having you stand beside him when he'd made a choice you didn't believe in. Jonas felt his throat tighten. He really said that? Word for word. It was about a week before he died. We were working late in the marshal's office, going through old case files. He got this faraway look and started talking about you. Said he hoped someday you'd come back to town, that maybe you could find a way to work together again. She paused. He loved you, Jonas. Never doubted it for a second. They sat in silence for a while, the only sound the wind moving through the pines and Della cropping at sparse grass. Jonas thought about all the things he'd wanted to say to Thomas, all the conversations they'd never had. 5 years of silence, ended by a woman bleeding in an abandoned cabin. The church, Jonas said finally. You hid the ledger in a hymnal. Which one exactly? There are about 40 in the choir loft. Father Benedict keeps them organized by number. It's in number 23, right side of the loft, 3rd row back. Claire met his eyes. But Jonas, we can't just walk into that church. Kane will have men watching it. He's not stupid. He knows I might have hidden evidence there. Then we'll have to be smarter than him. Jonas was already thinking through possibilities. You said Father Benedict knew which hymnal? I told him I'd hidden something important there. Didn't tell him what, but he understood it mattered. He's a good man. Fought in the war, saw terrible things. He'll help if he can. We need to get a message to him. And to Samuel Hewitt. Jonas rubbed his jaw, feeling the stubble there. Once we have the ledger, we need someone who can get it to the territorial governor without Kane intercepting it. How do we get a message into town without being seen? Jonas smiled grimly. The same way the old resistance fighters did during the war. We use people Kane would never suspect. Children, maybe. Or women from the church auxiliary. Someone who can pass through town without drawing attention. That's risky. Everything about this is risky. Jonas checked the sun's position. They had maybe 4 hours of daylight left. We need to keep moving, get closer to Greystone. Find a place where we can watch the town, see what we're dealing with. Claire struggled to her feet, and Jonas helped her mount Della. As he swung up behind her, she said, Jonas, thank you for everything. Thomas was right about you. He was wrong about a lot of things, Jonas said. But I'm working on making this one count. They rode north toward Greystone. Toward the confrontation Jonas had been avoiding for 5 years. Toward the truth about his brother's death. They reached the hills overlooking Greystone just after sunset. The town spread out below them, lamps being lit in windows, smoke rising from chimneys. From this distance it looked peaceful, almost welcoming. Jonas knew better. He found a sheltered spot among the rocks where they could watch the town without being seen and made a cold camp. No fire, just blankets and dried meat. Claire was fading fast, her skin hot to the touch despite the cold air. The infection was spreading. She needed real medicine, a real doctor, and soon. Tell me what I'm looking at, Jonas said, studying the town through the gathering darkness. Claire pointed with a trembling hand. Main Street runs north to south. Marshal's office is there, the big building with the porch. Church is on the east side, white steeple. Samuel's store is 3 buildings down from the marshal's office. Jonas could see gang members, or men who looked like gang members, posted at various points around town. 2 at the marshal's office, 1 outside the church, more scattered along the main street. They weren't hiding. They wanted people to see them, wanted the message to be clear. We own this town. Kane's not even trying to hide it anymore, Claire said. The corruption's completely out in the open. Jonas was about to respond when he saw something that made him freeze. A man emerged from the marshal's office, tall and broad-shouldered, moving with the heavy confidence of authority. Even from this distance, Jonas recognized Marshal David Kane. But what stopped Jonas cold was who Kane was talking to. A woman in a dark dress, and a small girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, holding the woman's hand. Who's that with him? Jonas asked. Claire squinted. I don't know. I've never seen them before. Jonas watched as Kane bent down to speak to the little girl, who laughed at something he said. The gesture was gentle, almost tender. Not the behavior of a corrupt lawman meeting with gang members. Something was wrong. Something didn't fit. Stay here, Jonas told Claire. I'm going into town. That's insane. I need to see something. Need to check the marshal's office. Jonas was already moving, pulling on his heavy coat. If I'm not back by midnight, you ride for the territorial capital. Don't wait for me, Jonas. But he was already gone, slipping down the hillside like a shadow. Getting into town was easier than he'd expected. The gang members were watching the roads, not the back alleys. Jonas moved through the darkness between buildings, a ghost in his own hometown, until he reached the rear window of the marshal's office. The window was locked, but Jonas had opened it before, years ago, when he'd been a deputy himself and had forgotten his keys. The trick was pressing just right on the frame while lifting. It gave with a soft click, and he slid inside. The office was dark, except for a lamp burning low on the desk. Jonas moved quickly, searching drawers, checking files. Looking for what, he wasn't entirely sure. Evidence of the payments Claire had described, maybe. Confirmation of the corruption. What he found instead was a journal. It was hidden in the bottom drawer of Kane's desk, beneath a false bottom that Jonas only discovered by accident. A leather-bound book, its pages filled with neat handwriting. Jonas carried it to the lamp and began reading. The first entry was dated 5 years ago, just a few months before Thomas died. They took her today. My Sarah. I came home and found Mary collapsed on the floor, beaten unconscious. When she woke, she told me everything. 3 men, faces covered. They took Sarah and left a message. Cooperate or she dies. I don't know what to do. I'm the marshal. I'm supposed to protect people, not make deals with criminals. But she's my daughter. She's 7 years old. How can I choose between her and my duty? They gave me a week to decide. God help me, I don't know what to choose. Jonas felt his hands shaking as he turned pages, reading Cain's descent into hell. The marshal had tried everything, sent secret messages to the territorial governor, tried to organize a rescue, even considered resigning his position. But the Blackwood gang had been one step ahead every time. They killed the messenger I sent, left his body on my porch with a note, "Stop trying to be clever. Do what you're told, or Sarah dies screaming." So I've made my choice. I'll cooperate. I'll do whatever they ask. And I'll pray that someday I'll get a chance to make this right. The entries continued, each one documenting another compromise, another betrayal of everything Cain believed in. Payments recorded, blind eyes turned, justice perverted. All to keep his daughter alive. Then Jonas found the entry about Thomas. Young Mercer came to my office tonight. Somehow he's found evidence of my cooperation with the gang. He wants my help to expose them. Doesn't understand why I'm hesitating. He's a good kid, idealistic, believes in the system the way I used to. I tried to warn him off, told him to let it go. But he won't. He's going to the territorial governor with what he knows. I sent word to Silas Blackwood. Told him about Mercer. I had to. If the gang thought I was helping with an investigation, they'd kill Sarah immediately. God forgive me. I've signed that boy's death warrant. But what else could I do? He's asking me to choose between him and my daughter. I can't, I won't. Tomorrow I'll wake up knowing I'm a murderer. But Sarah will still be alive. That has to be enough. Jonas couldn't read anymore. His vision blurred, and he realized he was crying. For Thomas, for Cain, for the impossible choice that had destroyed them both. He flipped through more pages looking for answers. The next entry made him stop cold. They killed her anyway. Even after I did everything they asked, gave them everything they wanted, they killed my Sarah. Found her body in the canyon 2 days after Mercer died. She'd been dead for at least a week. All of it was for nothing. Every compromise, every betrayal, every innocent person who suffered because I looked the other way, it was all for nothing. She was already dead when I sent Mercer to his death. I don't know why I'm still alive. Why I haven't put my gun in my mouth and ended this. Maybe because that would be too easy. Maybe I deserve to live with what I've done. The remaining entries were sparse, filled with self-loathing and hints of a plan. Cain was gathering his own evidence, building a case against the gang, trying to find some way to make amends for what he'd done. The last entry was dated just 2 weeks ago. Claire Alden has been helping me. She doesn't know it, but I've been feeding her information, helping her build a ledger of all the gang's activities. She thinks she's being clever, copying records in secret. She doesn't realize I'm leaving those records where she'll find them. When she runs, and she will run, the gang will chase her. They'll commit resources to hunting her down. And while they're distracted, I'll finally have a chance to strike. I sent word to the territorial governor 3 days ago. Real word this time, through channels the gang doesn't know about. Federal marshals are coming. 2 weeks, maybe less. If I can keep Claire alive until they arrive, maybe I can finally do something right. Maybe I can give Thomas Mercer's death some meaning. Jonas stood there in the dark office, the journal in his hands, his entire understanding of the last 5 years crumbling. Cain wasn't the villain. Cain was broken, destroyed by an impossible choice, trying desperately to make amends, and Claire had been bait. Not intentionally, not maliciously, but bait nonetheless. A way to draw the gang out into the open, where federal marshals could catch them. The question was, did Claire know? Jonas heard footsteps outside and quickly replaced the journal, moving to the window. But before he could leave, the office door opened and lamplight spilled in. Marshal David Kane stood in the doorway, alone. He looked older than Jonas remembered, his hair gone mostly grey, his face lined with exhaustion. But his hand was steady on the gun at his hip. "Jonas Mercer," Kane said quietly. "I wondered if you'd come. We need to talk." Jonas's hand moved toward his rifle, but Kane raised a palm in a gesture of peace. "I'm not your enemy," the marshal said. "Not anymore. Maybe I never was, though I know it doesn't feel that way to you. You got Thomas killed." Jonas's voice was raw. "I read your journal." Kane's shoulders sagged. "Then you know what they did to me. What they made me do." He closed the door behind him and moved slowly to his desk, keeping his hands visible. "Doesn't excuse it. Nothing excuses it. But maybe you understand now why I made the choices I made. Your daughter was already dead when you gave up Thomas." "I know." Kane sat heavily in his chair, suddenly looking like he'd aged another 10 years. "I've lived with that knowledge for 5 years. Every morning I wake up and remember that I sacrificed a good man for a daughter who was already in the ground. You think I don't know what that makes me? Jonas wanted to hate him, wanted to put a bullet in him for what he'd done to Thomas. But the man sitting across from him wasn't a villain. He was just broken, hollowed out by grief and guilt, until there was nothing left but the shell. "Claire," Jonas said. "Is she bait?" Kane met his eyes. "She doesn't know it, but yes. I've been feeding information to the territorial governor for months, building a case. When Claire started copying records, I made sure she got everything she needed. I knew the gang would come after her, knew they'd expose themselves trying to get the ledger back. You used her. I did. Same way I'm using you now that you've gotten involved." Kane leaned forward. "Federal marshals are coming, Jonas. Should be here in 2 days, 3 at most. If we can keep Claire alive that long, we can end this. The gang, the corruption, all of it. And if we can't, if she dies before they arrive, then we've failed. But at least we'll have tried." Kane pulled out a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses. "Your brother deserved better than what I gave him. He deserved someone who'd stand beside him instead of selling him out to save a child who was already dead. I can't fix that, but maybe I can make sure his death meant something." Jonas didn't touch the whiskey. "The gang has men all over town. How do you propose we keep Claire alive with Silas Blackwood and his crew hunting her?" "The church," Kane said. "It's the one place in town they won't attack openly. Too many witnesses, too much risk of bringing down more attention than they want. We get Claire inside, we fortify it, and we hold until the Federals arrive. Father Benedict isn't a fighter. No, but I am. So are you." Kane stood and walked to a cabinet, pulling out a rifle and a box of ammunition. "And there are good people in this town, Jonas. People who've been living in fear of the gang for years. You give them someone to rally behind, someone who'll stand up to Silas Blackwood, and they'll fight." Jonas considered it. The plan had merit, but it required trust. Trust in Kane, trust in townspeople who'd let corruption fester for years. Trust was in short supply. "Why should I believe you?" Jonas asked. "Why should I believe any of this isn't just another lie to serve whatever scheme you're running?" Kane opened a drawer and pulled out a folded paper. "Because I'm giving you this. It's a confession. Everything I did, everyone I betrayed, all of it written down and signed. When the federal marshals arrive, you give them this. I'll stand trial for my crimes." Jonas took the paper, scanned it. It was exactly what Kane claimed. A full confession to corruption, conspiracy, and accessory to murder. With this document, Kane would hang. "Why?" Jonas asked. "Because I'm tired, Jonas. Tired of living with what I've done. Tired of looking at myself in the mirror and seeing a coward." Kane's voice broke slightly. "Your brother was a hero. He stood for what was right, even when it cost him everything. The least I can do is try to honor that, even if it's too late to matter." Jonas folded the confession and tucked it inside his coat. "Claire's in the hills north of town. She's got an infection, needs medicine. I'll send Doc Morrison. He's one of the good ones, won't ask questions." Kane pulled out paper and began writing. "I'll tell him you're at the old Whitmore place. It's abandoned, about a mile from where you described. Get Claire there and the doc will meet you at midnight. And then we move her to the church tomorrow at dawn. Father Benedict is already preparing. He's got food, water, medical supplies stored in the cellar. We can hold out there for days if we need to. Jonas moved toward the window, then stopped. The journal. There's one thing you didn't write about. What's that? Thomas's last words. What did he actually say? Kane was quiet for a long moment. He said it. Tell Jonas I'm sorry. Tell him he was right to leave. Then he said something else, something I didn't understand at first. He said, the ledger's in the church, 23. Jonas felt his breath catch. Thomas had known about Claire's plan, had been part of it, maybe even helped her hide the evidence. His brother had died protecting the same truth Jonas was now fighting for. He was trying to finish what you'd started, Jonas said. He was a better man than me, Kane replied. Better than both of us, probably. But he's dead, and we're alive, and we owe it to him to see this through. Jonas climbed out the window without another word. He didn't trust Kane, couldn't trust him, not fully, but the marshal's pain was real and the plan was sound. Sometimes that had to be enough. He made his way back through the alleys to where he'd left Claire, moving carefully, watching for gang members. The town felt different now, charged with potential violence. People sensed something was coming. They just didn't know what yet. Claire was unconscious when he reached her, her breathing shallow and rapid. The infection had gotten worse. Jonas lifted her gently and carried her to the Whitmore place, an old farmhouse that sat empty and dark at the edge of town. He'd just gotten her settled in the barn when he heard a horse approaching. Jonas readied his rifle, then relaxed slightly when he recognized Doc Morrison, a thin man with grey hair and a black medical bag that had seen 40 years of service. Kane sent me, the doc said without preamble. Let me see her. For the next hour, Jonas watched as Doc Morrison worked with efficient competence. He cleaned Claire's wound properly, stitched what needed stitching, and administered something from a small bottle that he said would fight the infection. She'll live, the doc said finally. But she needs rest. Real rest, not running through mountains being chased by outlaws. She'll get it soon, Jonas said. One way or another. Doc Morrison packed up his bag and studied Jonas in the lamplight. I knew Thomas, good kid. Heard you were his brother, the one who left town. That's right. He never spoke ill of you. Used to say his brother was the smartest man he knew, that you'd left because you were smart enough to see how things really were. The doc paused at the barn door. For what it's worth, I think he'd be proud of you now, coming back to finish what he started. After the doc left, Jonas sat beside Claire and waited for dawn. He thought about Thomas, about all the things they'd left unsaid between them, about the choices men made when the world gave them only bad options. Claire stirred around 3 a.m. Jonas, I'm here. I had the strangest dream. I dreamed Thomas was standing beside me, telling me everything would be all right. She tried to smile. Stupid, right? No, Jonas said quietly. I don't think that's stupid at all. What happens now? Now we go to the church. We get that ledger and we hold until the federal marshals arrive. And if the gang comes for us. Jonas checked his Winchester, making sure it was loaded and ready. Then we give them the fight Thomas never got to finish. As the first grey light of dawn began filtering through the cracks in the barn, Jonas heard horses approaching. Multiple horses, moving fast. He moved to the door and looked out. Silas Blackwood and at least 8 men were riding into town, all of them armed, all of them looking for blood. They stopped in front of the marshal's office, and Jonas watched as Silas dismounted and went inside. 5 minutes later, Silas came back out. Even from this distance, Jonas could see the fury on his face. He knows, Claire whispered, appearing at Jonas's shoulder. Kane must have told him we're here, but Jonas shook his head. No, look, Kane was being dragged out of the marshal's office by 2 gang members. His face was bloody, his hands bound. Silas said something Jonas couldn't hear, then struck Kane across the face. They've turned on him, Jonas said. They know he's been planning something. What do we do? Jonas made his decision in an instant. We stick to the plan. We get to the church, get the ledger, and we hold. Kane knew the risks, but as they prepared to move, Jonas couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to go very, very wrong. They made it to the church just as the sun cleared the eastern hills, painting Greystone in shades of gold and red. Jonas helped Claire through the side door. his rifle ready, expecting gunfire at any moment. But the street remained quiet, eerie in its emptiness. Father Benedict was waiting for them, an old man with white hair and steady hands that had baptized babies and buried their grandparents. He took one look at Claire and ushered them toward the cellar stairs. "Cain sent word last night," the priest said. "Told me you'd be coming. I've prepared as best I could." The cellar was better stocked than Jonas had expected. Crates of food, barrels of water, medical supplies, even ammunition. Cain had been planning this for longer than Jonas realized. "The hymnal," Jonas said. "Number 23, third row, back in the choir loft?" Father Benedict nodded. "I've left it exactly where Miss Alden placed it. Didn't seem right to disturb it." Jonas climbed the stairs back into the main church and made his way to the choir loft. The hymnals were arranged neatly on a shelf, numbered in faded gold leaf. He found 23 and opened it. The book had been hollowed out, leaving just enough pages at the front and back to maintain the illusion. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a leather-bound ledger. Jonas carried it down to the cellar and laid it on a rough wooden table. Claire sat down with trembling hands and opened it. "This is it," she breathed. 3 years of payments, names, dates. Everything we need to bring down the whole network. Jonas scanned the pages. She was right. The evidence was damning and detailed. Cain's name appeared throughout, but so did dozens of others. Town council members, deputies, even a territorial judge. The corruption ran deeper than he'd imagined. "We need to get this to the federal marshals," Jonas said. "But first, we need to survive long enough for them to arrive." As if summoned by his words, they heard the sound of horses outside. Many horses. Jonas moved to the small cellar window and looked out. Silas Blackwood and his gang had arrived at the church, at least a dozen men now, all of them armed. They spread out around the building, surrounding it. Silas dismounted and walked to the church doors. "Jonas Mercer," he called out. "I know you're in there! Come out and bring the woman and we'll make this quick." Jonas said nothing, checking his Winchester's magazine. 18 rounds. The revolver at his hip had 6 more. Not enough for a sustained fight, but maybe enough to hold them until help arrived, if help was coming at all. "You've got 1 minute to decide," Silas shouted. "After that, we start burning buildings until you come out." Claire touched Jonas's arm. "You should go. Take the ledger and run. I'll surrender to them. That's not happening. Jonas, this isn't your fight. It became my fight the moment they killed Thomas." Jonas moved to the cellar stairs. "Father, can you shoot?" The old priest smiled grimly. "I was at Shiloh. I remember how." Jonas handed him the revolver. 6 rounds. "Make them count. Protect Claire and that ledger with your life. Where are you going?" Claire demanded. "To even the odds." Jonas climbed the stairs to the main floor of the church. The building was old, built from thick logs that would stop most bullets, with narrow windows that provided good firing positions. He could hold them here for a while, if he was smart and lucky. He positioned himself at a side window, where he had a clear view of most of Silas's men. They were still mounted, thinking this would be quick and easy. That arrogance would cost them. Jonas took careful aim at the nearest rider and fired. The man dropped from his saddle, and chaos erupted. Horses reared and scattered as Jonas worked the lever and fired again, then again. 2 more men went down before the gang found cover. Return fire came fast and heavy, bullets slamming into the church's walls. Wood splintered and glass shattered, but the thick logs held. Jonas moved to a different window, fired twice more, then moved again. The key was keeping them guessing, never letting them pin down his position. "You're just making this harder on yourself," Silas screamed. "We'll burn you out!" "Burn the whole damn church?" Jonas saw 2 men running toward the building with torches, clearly planning to do exactly that. He shot one of them, but the other made it to the church wall. Then gunfire erupted from an unexpected direction, the general store across the street. Someone was shooting at the gang from behind. Samuel Hewitt appeared in the store's doorway with a rifle, and he wasn't alone. 3 other townsmen were with him, all armed. "About time you people grew a spine," Samuel shouted at the gang. "Now get the hell out of our town!" More townspeople emerged from buildings along the street, some with rifles, some with shotguns, some with nothing but courage. The gang suddenly found themselves surrounded, Silas's face twisted with rage. "Kill them! Kill them all!" The battle for Greystone had begun. The street erupted into warfare. Bullets flew from every direction as townspeople who'd lived in fear for years finally found their courage. Samuel Hewitt coordinated the defense from the general store, his years as a Texas Ranger showing in his calm commands and steady aim. Jonas used the confusion to slip out of the church through a side door. If he could flank the gang, catch them in a crossfire between himself and the townspeople, they might actually win this. He moved through the alley behind the church, staying low, using buildings for cover. Ahead, he could see 3 gang members taking position behind a water trough. They were focused on the townspeople, didn't see Jonas coming. He shot the first one before they knew he was there. The other 2 spun around, but Jonas was already moving, diving behind a pile of lumber. Their bullets chewed up the wood as he circled, coming at them from a new angle. 2 shots, 2 men down, but the gunfire had drawn attention. Jonas heard running footsteps and turned to see Silas Blackwood himself, rifle raised. They fired simultaneously. Jonas felt the bullet tug at his coat, heard it whine past his ear. His own shot hit Silas in the shoulder, spinning him around. But the gang leader didn't go down. He stumbled into the space between 2 buildings, and Jonas followed. The alley was narrow, barely wide enough for 2 men. Silas was at the far end, his back against a wall, blood spreading across his shirt. But his eyes were clear and his gun was steady. "Your brother died begging," Silas said, his voice ragged but defiant. Crying like a child. Jonas felt the rage rise, but this time he controlled it. "You're lying." "Am I?" Silas grinned, blood on his teeth. "He called out for you at the end." "Jonas," he said. "Where's Jonas?" "I need Jonas." Pathetic. Thomas was worth 10 of you. Thomas was a fool who died for nothing. "Just like you're about to." Silas raised his gun, but Jonas was faster. He fired once, the bullet catching Silas high in the chest. The gang leader's gun clattered to the ground, and he slid down the wall, leaving a smear of blood on the wood. Jonas walked closer, keeping his rifle trained. Silas looked up at him, struggling to breathe. "Any last words?" Jonas asked. Silas coughed, spitting blood. "Yeah. You think killing me ends this? There's always another gang, another corrupt lawman. The system's rotten, Mercer. You can't fix it, maybe not. But I can damn well try, just like your brother tried." Silas's eyes were dimming. Look how that worked out. Jonas thought about Thomas, about the ledger, about all the people who'd finally stood up today. "Actually," he said quietly, "I think it worked out exactly how Thomas planned." Silas tried to say something else, but the words never came. His eyes went flat and he slumped sideways. Jonas stood there for a moment feeling nothing, no satisfaction, no triumph, just tired. So tired of death and violence and the endless cycle of corruption. He turned and walked back toward the main street. The battle was winding down. The gang members who weren't dead had thrown down their weapons and were being rounded up by townspeople. Samuel Hewitt stood in the middle of the street directing operations like the lawman he'd once been. "Jonas!" Samuel called out. "You all right?" "Silas is dead." Samuel nodded grimly. "Good. The rest of them will hang." He looked around at the townspeople, many of them bloodied, but all of them standing tall. "We did it! We actually did it! Where's Kane?" Samuel pointed toward the marshal's office. "Gang had him tied up in there. Doc Morrison's with him now." Jonas walked to the office and found Marshal Kane sitting on the floor, his back against the wall. His face was a mess of bruises, and his hands were torn from the ropes. "But he was alive. It's done," Jonas told him. "The gang's finished." Kane closed his eyes. "Thank God. Federal marshals will be here soon. I'm giving them your confession." "I know." Kane looked at Jonas. "I deserve whatever's coming. But tell me, did we get the ledger? Did Thomas's death mean something?" Jonas pulled the ledger from inside his coat. "We got it. Every name, every payment, everything. For the first time in what might have been years." Kane smiled. "Then maybe there's hope after all." As Jonas left the marshal's office, he saw riders approaching from the east. 5 men wearing federal marshal badges, led by a grey-haired man with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense bearing. The cavalry had arrived. Better late than never, Jonas thought. He walked to the church to check on Claire and found her standing in the doorway, pale but steady, watching the clean-up operation with Father Benedict beside her. "It's over," Jonas said. Claire smiled, tears streaming down her face. "Thomas would be proud of you." Jonas looked at the town he'd abandoned 5 years ago, at the people who'd finally found their courage, at the evidence that would bring down a network of corruption. "Yeah," he said softly. Maybe he would. 2 weeks later, Jonas stood at Thomas's grave on the hill overlooking Greystone. The stone was simple, just his brother's name and dates, but someone, probably Father Benedict, had kept it clean and adorned with fresh flowers. Claire appeared beside him, moving slowly but steadily. Doc Morrison had done good work, and her natural toughness had done the rest. "She'd testify at the trials," she'd said. "Make sure everyone who'd taken money from the Blackwood gang faced justice." "I brought these," she said, laying a small bouquet at the base of the stone. Wildflowers, the kind Thomas had always liked. They stood in silence for a while, listening to the wind move through the grass. Below them, Greystone was coming back to life. With Kane awaiting trial and the gang destroyed, people could finally breathe again. Business was returning to normal. Children played in the streets without fear. The territorial governor was impressed with the ledger, Claire said. "He's appointed a special prosecutor. They expect the trials to last months." "Good. He offered you a job." "Did Samuel tell you?" Jonas nodded. "Said they need a new marshal. Someone people can trust." "What did you say?" "I haven't decided yet." Jonas knelt and touched the gravestone. "I spent 5 years running away from responsibility, Claire. Told myself I was seeking peace, but really I was just hiding. I'm not sure I'm ready to put on a badge again." "Thomas believed you were." Jonas looked up at her. "How do you know?" "Because he told me. That night we were working late, going through the files. He said his brother was the best lawman he'd ever known, and someday you'd remember that." Claire smiled. "He said you just needed the right reason to come back. And did he say what that reason would be?" "He said you'd know it when you found it." Jonas stood, brushing dirt from his knees. The badge the territorial governor had offered him was in his coat pocket. He'd been carrying it around for 3 days, turning it over in his hands, feeling its weight. Marshal of Greystone. A position of trust and responsibility. Everything he'd run from 5 years ago. But 5 years ago, he'd been running from corruption, from a system that seemed broken beyond repair. Things were different now. The ledger had exposed dozens of corrupt officials, and the territorial governor was cleaning house. It wasn't perfect, it would never be perfect, but it was better. And maybe that was enough. "Samuel's retiring," Jonas said. "Too old for the store," he says. "Wants to spend time with his grandchildren." He earned it. The building's for sale. Good location, established business. Claire looked at him thoughtfully. "Are you thinking of buying it?" "Thinking about it. Town needs a good general store, and I know the business. Worked enough different jobs over the years." He paused. "Could use a partner, though. Someone with bookkeeping experience." Claire laughed, the first genuine laugh he'd heard from her. "Are you offering me a job, Jonas Mercer?" "More like a partnership. 50-50 split. You handle the books and orders, I handle the inventory and customers." He met her eyes. "It would give you a reason to stay in Greystone. Put down roots. I thought you were considering the marshal position." "I was, but I realized something standing here. Thomas didn't die so I could go back to being a lawman. He died trying to save a town from corruption, trying to give people a chance to live without fear. The best way I can honor that isn't by wearing a badge. It's by being part of this community. Building something good." Claire was quiet for a moment, considering. "A general store. An honest business in an honest town. It's a start." "All right," she said. "Partners." They shook hands, and Jonas felt something settle inside him, a sense of rightness he hadn't experienced in years. This was the path forward. Not as a lawman, not as a loner in the mountains, but as a member of a community working to build something better. Marshal David Kane's trial was set for next month. Jonas would testify, would tell the court about the journal, about the impossible choices, and the daughter who died. It wouldn't save Cain. The man had admitted to too much, enabled too many crimes. But maybe it would help people understand. Maybe it would keep the next lawman from making the same mistakes. As they walked back down the hill toward town, Claire said, "There's something I've been meaning to ask you." "What's that?" "That first day in the cabin. You could have left me there. Could have ridden away and kept living your quiet life in the mountains. Why didn't you?" Jonas thought about it. "Because of the locket. Because you had Thomas's picture, and that meant you knew something about his death. And I couldn't—" He paused, searching for the right words. "I couldn't let another person die because I chose to look away." "You're a good man, Jonas Mercer." "I'm trying to be. That's the best any of us can do." They reached the main street of Greystone, where Samuel Hewitt was waiting outside his store with paperwork and a bottle of good whiskey to seal their deal. Father Benedict was there too, and Doc Morrison, and a dozen other townspeople who'd become friends rather than strangers. Jonas Mercer, the mountain man who'd spent 5 years hiding from the world, had finally come home, and Thomas, wherever he was, could rest easy knowing his brother had finally found his way. The sun was setting over Greystone, painting the sky in shades of amber and gold. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new struggles. But tonight, standing on the main street of his hometown, with honest people around him and purpose in his heart, Jonas felt something he hadn't experienced in 5 long years. Peace, not the false peace of isolation, but the real peace that came from standing for something, from being part of something larger than himself, from finally truly being home.